Imagine holding an architectural blueprint for like a massive towering skyscraper.
Okay, I am picturing it.
Right. You're looking at the schematics, those solid white lines on the blue paper.
Yeah.
And you just inherently trust the engineering.
Yeah, you assume the load-bearing walls are actually where they need to be.
Exactly. You trust that the foundation goes deep enough into the bedrock so the whole thing doesn't just collapse. But what happens when you discover that the foundational math, like the very formulas used to draw those lines, might be entirely fabricated?
Oh, wow. Well, then the entire structure just becomes a massive liability.
Right.
You're no longer looking at a sanctuary or a safe haven. You are looking at a total disaster waiting to happen.
And that architectural tension is basically the exact premise of the text we're dissecting today. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone.
I'm glad you're joining us for this one.
Yeah, today we are exploring a profoundly disruptive book. It's called Bastion of Divine Truth, Part 1, by Rian Engelbrecht. And when I say disruptive, I mean he really takes a sledgehammer to the foundation of modern institutional religion.
He really does.
He goes after secular humanism and pretty much everything in between. Engelbrecht pulls zero punches here. He goes after modern church boards, evolutionary theory, communist ideology, and these deeply entrenched social structures.
Right, which means we need to pause for a second.
Yes, absolutely. Crucial disclaimer time for you listening. Because his claims are so uncompromising and politically charged, we need to be crystal clear right up front.
We aren't here to co-sign his politics or, endorse his theology or defend the institutions he attacks.
Not at all. We are not taking sides.
Exactly. Our role today is strictly to map out these really explosive, fascinating ideas he brings to the table. We just want to help you understand the architecture of his argument.
Right. We're dissecting the premise, not advocating for it. And his core premise is that humanity has constructed this sprawling, global, religious and philosophical edifice that, it fundamentally isolates us from the unadulterated truth.
Yeah, he isn't just critiquing the paint job on the building.
No.
He's arguing that we literally need to bulldoze the entire structure and return to a terrifyingly simple, almost primitive state of interaction with the divine.
Okay, so if we're throwing away the blueprints, where do we actually start the demolition? It seems like Engelbrecht begins by targeting the very vocabulary we use, right?
Yeah, specifically how we define the word church.
Let's get into that. Because language is where he thinks the foundational math went wrong.
Right. So Engelbrecht points to the original Greek word used in the New Testament texts, which is ecclesia.
Ecclesia.
Yes. Yeah. And in the Greco-Roman world of the first century, ecclesia had a very specific secular civic meaning.
Like a town hall or something?
Kind of, yeah. It referred to an assembly of citizens who were called out from their private homes into a public square. They'd gather to deliberate on matters of the city. So when early Christians adopted that term, it maintained that really organic definition.
So it was just an assembly of people called out for a shared purpose.
Exactly. It wasn't a structure. It was the people.
But, if I walk down the street today and point to a building with a steeple and stained glass,
right,
literally anyone would say, that's a church.
Right.
The word has become entirely synonymous with physical real estate and, a corporate structure. So how does Engelbrecht track that massive mutation?
He tracks it directly through the evolution of translation and tradition. He lands really heavily on the King James Bible and the Protestant Reformation.
Oh, interesting. Why then?
Well, by the time those translations were codified in the 16th and 17th centuries, the European world had already endured roughly 1,000 years of intense cathedral building.
Ah, okay. I see where this is going.
Yeah, the culture was totally saturated with the physical architecture of religion. So when translators encountered ecclesia, they didn't translate it as assembly or congregation.
They translated it as church.
Yes, which comes from the Old English word "ciris," which always implied a physical house of worship. Engelbrecht argues this wasn't just a linguistic shift, It
was a psychological hijacking.
Exactly.
But wait, that assumes the translation choice was purely a cultural accident, though. I would imagine institutional powers, like, say, a 17th century monarchy.
Oh, they definitely benefited.
Right. They benefited greatly from that centralized religious authority into a physical building that they could easily control and tax.
You're hitting on the exact structural corruption he's calling out. By anchoring the faith to a physical building and a hierarchical institution, faith just ceased to be an internal spiritual state of being.
It mutated into an external activity.
Right. You no longer were the church, you went to the church.
Okay, let's unpack this for you listening. It sounds like we've treated human spirituality the exact same way we treated gym membership.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Like, people sign up for the megachurch, they scan their metaphorical membership card at the door on a Sunday morning, sit in the air conditioning for an hour, and just assume they are spiritually healthy.
All the while ignoring everything else.
Right. Completely ignoring their actual spiritual diet and exercise the other 6 days of the week, basically because they've outsourced the heavy lifting to the facility and, well, the professionals on stage.
That analogy perfectly captures the systemic laziness that Engelbrecht is diagnosing here.
Wow.
And because we built this man-made artificial institution, we had to invent man-made rules to keep the lights on and the staff paid.
Naturally.
Which leads directly into his aggressive critique of modern church practices, starting with the whole division between the clergy and the laity.
Right. The idea that there is a special class of elite ordained professionals who somehow have a more direct line to God,
while the rest of the congregation are essentially just spectators.
Yeah.
Engelbrecht argues that this completely defies the New Testament concept of a holy priesthood of all believers. But, he reserves his harshest architectural critique for the modern enforcement of tithing.
Oh, man. Let's drill into the tithing argument. Because for anyone listening who grew up in or around institutional Christianity, giving 10% of your income is presented as an absolute unquestionable law.
It's non-negotiable in a lot of places.
Yeah. If you don't tithe, you're stealing from God. But Engelbrecht entirely dismantles that, doesn't he?
He completely deconstructs it, and he uses the biblical text itself to do it. He points his readers to Deuteronomy 14.
Okay, what's in there?
He argues that the biblical tithe was an explicitly Old Testament agrarian law. It was intricately linked to the physical land of Canaan.
Grain, wine, livestock, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And it was designed specifically to sustain the ancient Levitical priesthood, who, by law, were not allowed to own land.
Okay, so he's saying that taking an ancient agrarian tax meant for a specific geographic priesthood and applying it to modern corporate church salaries and building funds is, well, it's a bait and switch?
He goes a lot further than calling it a bait and switch.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he calls it a deception that turns the modern assembly into a den of thieves.
A den of thieves.
Thieves.
Wow. Now, he is careful to clarify that the new covenant does introduce a ministry of joyful, free will, sacrificial giving to support the community and the poor.
Right, giving out of generosity.
Yes, but a mandated, law-based 10% tax enforced by guilt. He views that as an artificial mechanism designed solely to maintain the man-made empire of the physical building.
But wait, if we accept his premise, like if we throw away the buildings, the tithing, the clergy, all that infrastructure, we are left in a massive void.
Total blank slate.
Yeah. If the structure is a counterfeit, it forces us to question the actual curriculum being taught inside that structure.
Yeah.
What is the actual message supposed to be if all the scaffolding is removed? And this brings us to the core of his theological philosophy. The concept of unadulterated truth.
Unadulterated truth.
Engelbrecht anchors this in the Great Commission found in Matthew 28. That's where Jesus instructs his disciples to teach the nations to observe everything that he commanded them.
The operative word there being unadulterated.
Exactly.
Like no additives, no artificial flavors, no cultural preservatives, just the pure message.
Unmingled and undiluted. And Engelbrecht takes an incredibly hardline stance here. He points to the existence of over 3,000 different Christian denominations globally.
3,000.
Yeah. And for him, this isn't a sign of a vibrant, diverse faith. He says it is an absolute tragedy and a logical absurdity.
Why an absurdity?
Because a denomination inherently implies that there are varying options on doctrines, different ways to interpret the divine.
Okay, here is where I have to push back, just on behalf of a modern listener. We live in a world that deeply values nuance, right?
All right.
Human beings are inherently flawed interpreters. We all have cultural blind spots. Isn't demanding one rigid, absolute, unadulterated truth incredibly dangerous?
It can definitely sound that way.
Historically, whenever a single group or a single person claims to possess the sole, unadulterated truth, without any room for multiple perspectives, it inevitably leads to authoritarianism and abuse.
Oh, without question, history's full of that.
So how does Engelbrecht prevent his demand for absolute truth from just becoming, another dictatorship?
That is the critical friction point of the whole book. And Engelbrecht's defense against authoritarianism is his definition of what the truth actually is.
Okay.
He argues that authoritarianism happens when humans try to enforce a system of truth, like a set of rules or doctrines.
Theology.
Right. But Engelbrecht insists that the truth is not a philosophy, it is a person.
Meaning Jesus.
Yes. He points to Jesus' claim, I am the truth. Therefore, you cannot legislate it, you cannot institutionalize it, and you certainly cannot force it on a population through a church board.
Oh, I see.
It can only be experienced relationally. The moment a human tries to institutionalize it, they adulterate it.
So, any human attempt to organize the truth inherently corrupts it. That explains his hostility toward the 3,000 denominations.
Yeah, and that exact same framework explains his sweeping attacks on secular philosophy, too.
Okay, let's pivot to that.
Engelbrecht argues that humanity is constantly trying to build what he calls pseudo-realities.
Pseudo-reality.
Yes, he frames this as a spiritual conflict. He claims that Satan's primary weapon isn't overt evil, but the construction of counterfeit truths that just seem entirely logical to the human mind.
He takes aim at some massive philosophical heavyweights here. I mean, Descartes, Locke, Darwin, Marx. Yeah. Walk us through how he connects these entirely different schools of thought into one overarching pseudo-reality.
He views them as a progression of human ego.
Okay.
Let's look at empiricism, championed by thinkers like John Locke. Locke famously proposed the tabula rasa, the blank slate. He argued that all human knowledge comes strictly from sensory experience. If you can't see it, touch it, measure it, or observe it, it essentially doesn't exist, or at least it cannot be known.
Which is basically the foundation of the modern scientific method.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
But Engelbrecht argues that by elevating sensory experience to the ultimate arbiter of reality, empiricism violently cuts humanity off from the supernatural realm.
It traps us in a physical box.
Exactly. Then he moves to Descartes, who is famous for the phrase, I think, therefore I am.
Right.
Engelbrecht sees this as the ultimate subtle deception, centering reality entirely on the human mind and human consciousness rather than the divine.
He would probably argue the phrase should be, God is, therefore I am.
That is precisely his point. Once the human mind and sensory experience become the center of reality, Engelbrecht argues it creates a vacuum, and secular ideologies rush in to fill it.
So where does Darwin fit into this?
He points to Darwinian evolution as a pseudo-reality that removes divine intention from human existence, replacing it with random biological mechanics.
Okay, and then he goes after political ideologies too, right?
Yes, he extends this to communism, mentioning Marx and the historical implementations in Russia and China.
How does that tie back to the pseudo-reality?
Well, in Engelbrecht's view, these systems attempt to create an artificial utopia by exalting the state and the collective human intellect into the position of God.
Wow.
They are the ultimate, terrifying culmination of building a reality based solely on human logic.
It's a fascinating, sweeping historical critique. He's essentially saying that for the last few centuries, human philosophy and science have been meticulously building a giant collective sensory illusion.
That's his argument.
But, how is a person supposed to live in the modern world while completely rejecting its foundational philosophies? Does he expect people to just check out of society, move to a cabin in the woods?
Not at all. He actually offers the biblical prophet Daniel as the ultimate prototype for the modern believer.
Oh, Daniel. Okay, set the scene for us.
Look at Daniel's context. He was a captive exiled to Babylon, which was arguably the most powerful, secular, and pagan empire of its time.
He definitely wasn't living in a religious bubble.
No, he was actively serving in the highest levels of the government under kings like Nebuchadnezzar and Darius. He lived through the complete collapse of one empire and the rise of another.
Daniel literally watched worldviews shift overnight. He watched kings lose their minds, watched the entire cultural definition of truth change depending on who was sitting on the throne at the time.
And through it all, Daniel functioned within the system without ever adopting the system's pseudo-reality.
He kept his distance internally.
Exactly. He remained anchored to an unchanging supernatural reality, even when it looked completely foolish or politically dangerous, facing the lion's den.
Right.
Engelbrecht is challenging the listener to operate like Daniel, to exist within modern secular frameworks without letting the cultural pseudo-realities dictate your internal spiritual foundation.
Okay, so the secular world is operating on a flawed sensory wavelength. The philosophies of Locke and Marx build counterfeit realities. But for an audience familiar with theology, critiques of the secular world are, pretty standard fare.
Yeah, you hear that a lot.
The truly provocative twist in Engelbrecht's book isn't about the secular world's rejection of truth. It's about his diagnosis of the disease inside the walls of the ecclesia itself.
Yeah, and this is where his deep textual analysis gets incredibly sharp. He points to the Apostle Paul's second letter to Timothy, specifically chapter 3.
Now, anyone who has spent time in traditional religious circles has heard 2 Timothy 3 quoted 1,000 times.
Oh, at least 1,000.
Preachers have used it for centuries to just point out the window at whatever the current cultural, moral panic is.
Yes. The passage warns that in the last days, perilous times will come.
Right.
Paul writes that people will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, unforgiving, without self-control, and lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God.
And historically, theologians and pastors have read that list, looked at the Roman Empire or the Roaring '20s or, the modern internet age, and said, look at how depraved the secular culture is getting. Paul's prophecy is coming true.
Exactly. But Engelbrecht says that centuries of theologians have had their historical blinders on.
Really?
Yeah, they've been pointing their fingers out the window when they really should have been pointing them at the pews.
That is such a wild paradigm shift.
It is his central, staggering claim. Engelbrecht insists that Paul was not writing a cultural commentary on the pagan world. Paul was writing an administrative letter to Timothy, who was a young pastor.
Instructing him on how to manage the church.
Exactly. Engelbrecht's analysis of the original Greek text reveals that the apostasy, the lawlessness, the intense narcissism, like the phrase lovers of self or philautos in Greek.
Yeah.
He says these are spiritual diseases infecting the believers inside the assembly.
The call is coming from inside the house.
Yes. And he anchors this to the specific verse where Paul says, these people hold a form of piety, but deny the power of it.
Think about that for a second. An atheist or a secular humanist doesn't hold a form of piety.
Right.
They don't pretend to be religious. The only person who holds a form of godliness is someone sitting right there in the church building.
Exactly. They look the part. They know the vocabulary. They participate in the external institutional structure we discussed earlier.
But there is no internal transformation.
None. Engelbrecht calls this a terrifying internal rebellion, and he provides very specific contemporary examples of what this actually looks like in practice.
Let's definitely talk about those examples,
Yeah.
because he's totally unsparing in his critique of the modern religious consumer. He uses this phrase, supermarket society.
Oh, it's a supermarket society. He argues that the modern churchgoer treats theology the way a consumer treats a grocery store aisle.
Just browsing the shelves.
Yeah. If a teaching challenges their lifestyle, their political affiliation, or just their comfort, they simply drive down the street to a different denomination that offers a product more suited to their tastes.
They shop for pastors who just affirm their pre-existing biases.
Exactly. They want a religion that serves the self, which ties directly back to Paul's warning about lovers of self.
Have you ever seen a system, maybe a company or a community you were a part of, that completely lost its original purpose but just kept doing all the empty rituals?
Yeah.
That's what the author is seeing in modern religion. And he connects this consumerism to the biblical story of the golden calf, doesn't he?
Mm.
Which I think is a brilliant psychological parallel.
The psychology of Exodus 32 is vital to his argument here.
Set that up for us.
So Moses is up on Mount Sinai, receiving the unadulterated truth directly from the divine, but he's gone for 40 days.
And the people get restless.
The Israelites down below get very impatient. They are terrified of the invisible, intangible nature of God. They want something they can see, touch, and control. So they pool their resources and literally forge a physical calf out of gold.
They want a God that fits into their sensory reality. They're basically operating like John Locke, centuries before John Locke even existed.
That's exactly.
They need an empirical God.
That's a really profound connection. Engelbrecht argues that modern institutional religion is doing the exact same thing.
How so?
Whenever we mix divine truth with human business practices or slick marketing campaigns or the desire for cultural relevance, we are building a golden calf.
We're trying to make the divine manageable.
Yes. He links this directly to the Apostle Paul's discussion in Romans 7 about the beast of sinful flesh.
The beast.
It's the internal, carnal desire that fundamentally resists submitting to a reality it cannot control.
So if the church is suffering from this internal apostasy, if it is filled with lovers of money who are treating theology like a supermarket and building golden calves out of marketing budgets, we have a fundamental economic problem.
A massive one.
These institutions are trying to build a supernatural, spiritual kingdom using earthly, natural resources. Which brings us to one of the most fascinating frameworks in the entire book, his concept of heavenly economics.
Yes, Engelbrecht introduces the idea of the currency of heaven.
The currency of heaven.
It's a paradigm shift that exposes the absolute futility of how modern religion operates. His premise is beautifully simple. Earthly currencies, US dollars, euros, yen, they have zero purchasing power in the spiritual realm.
You literally can't bribe the divine with a stock portfolio.
No.
You can't fund a spiritual awakening by passing a collection plate.
And yet, Engelbrecht notes, that is exactly what the modern institution tries to do, which leads directly to his total deconstruction of the prosperity gospel.
Oh, the prosperity gospel. This has deeply infected the church over the last few decades.
It really has. The prosperity gospel essentially preaches a transactional relationship with God. If you sow financial seeds into a ministry, God is obligated to bless you with earthly wealth, health, and success.
It's treating God like a cosmic slot machine. You put a $20 bill in the offering bucket, pull the handle of prayer, and just wait for the jackpot.
Engelbrecht views this as the ultimate apostasy. He argues that praying for earthly money to build a spiritual kingdom is economically absurd.
Right.
It is like walking into a rural grocery store in the American Midwest and trying to buy a loaf of bread with ancient Roman coins.
The cashier will just stare at you.
Exactly. It is the wrong currency. Earthly money cannot cure a terminal disease, it cannot buy a moment of genuine peace, and it certainly cannot save a soul.
It only has utility in the natural sensory world.
If you want to transact with heaven, you must use heaven's currency.
And heaven's currency, according to Engelbrecht, is faith. But we really need to define that word carefully here, because faith is one of those religious buzzwords that has lost almost all of its meaning today.
It really has become diluted.
He makes a razor-sharp distinction between faith and trust. What is the actual mechanic of this currency?
It is a vital mechanical distinction. Engelbrecht defines faith as the foundational belief that God can do something.
Okay, God can.
Yes, it is the acknowledgement of divine power and capability. It is knowing the bank exists and holds immense wealth.
Right.
But trust is the kinetic action of that belief. Trust is believing that God will act in your specific situation according to his perfect wisdom, even when it completely defies sensory logic.
Okay, let's ground this for you, the listener. Using his economic framework, faith is like logging into your banking app and seeing that you have $1 million in your account.
Nice.
You possess the wealth. You know it's there. But trust is the act of walking up to the register, taking out your debit card, and actually swiping it to make a purchase.
Perfect visualization.
You can possess the currency of faith your entire life, but it remains completely dormant and useless in the spiritual realm unless you actually spend it through the kinetic act of trust.
And Engelbrecht grounds this entire economic theory in the ultimate biblical metaphor, the two trees in the Garden of Eden.
The tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life.
Exactly. He maps human behavior directly to these two trees, relying on earthly currency, leaning on human intellect, utilizing corporate marketing to grow a church, preaching the prosperity gospel.
All of that is feeding from the tree of knowledge.
Yes, they feed the natural flesh. They make complete sense to the empirical sensory mind of a Descartes or a Locke, but they produce spiritual death.
So how do you actually feed from the tree of life?
By operating exclusively in the currency of faith, trusting the unseen.
Do we have examples of that?
He points to historical figures who successfully spent this currency. Look at Abel, the son of Adam. He offered a better sacrifice than his brother Cain, not because of the material value of the offering, but because Abel offered it in genuine faith.
While Cain just offered his as a religious transactional duty.
Exactly. Or look at Enoch, who walked in such deep, continuous trust with the divine that he bypassed death entirely.
Oh.
Or consider the woman in the New Testament with the chronic issue of blood.
That's a great example.
She didn't consult a priest or follow a religious ritual. She simply reached out and touched the hem of Jesus's garment in desperate trust, and she literally drew supernatural healing power out of him.
She swiped the debit card.
She spent the currency, and the transaction was instantaneous.
But here's the crux of the issue.
Yeah.
To truly use this currency, to have that kind of reckless trust, you have to have a deeply intimate, ongoing relationship with the banker, so to speak.
You do.
You can't just know about God. You have to actually know God. Empty rituals, 3,000 denominations, golden calves, none of that will ever produce that intimacy.
Never.
Which brings us to the most profound, unresolved friction in Engelbrecht's entire book. If all the infrastructure is fake, how did humans interact with the divine before religion was even invented?
Right.
Before there were Bibles, priests, or tithing schedules? This is where we arrive at the emotional and philosophical climax of his work.
It is the ultimate synthesis of his entire teardown. After bulldozing the institutions, rejecting the pseudo-realities, exposing the internal apostasy, Engelbrecht finally answers the most fundamental question.
What does it actually mean to be a follower of Christ?
Exactly. And his answer is incredibly simple, yet almost impossibly difficult for the modern, overstimulated mind to grasp. He says it is entirely about returning to a state of sonship and daughtership.
He is pointing us all the way back to Genesis, back to Eden.
Think about the mechanics of Adam and Eve's existence in the garden. They didn't possess a canon of scripture to memorize.
No.
They didn't have a theological framework, a worship band, or a building to attend on Sundays. Their entire spiritual reality consisted of walking with the Creator in the cool of the day.
Just walking and talking.
It was an unbroken, intimate, conversational dynamic between a parent and a child. There was no mediation, there was no structure, there was only relationship.
But then the fall happens. The relationship shatters, and humanity spends the next several millennia desperately trying to build religious ladders to climb back up to that lost intimacy.
Whether it's the Tower of Babel, or the Levitical priesthood, or modern megachurches.
They're all ladders.
Yes. But Engelbrecht argues that Jesus didn't come to earth to provide a better ladder.
Right.
The Apostle Paul refers to Jesus as the second Adam. Engelbrecht insists that Jesus didn't incarnate to establish a new, burdensome religion or a vast bureaucracy. He came to perfectly model the sonship that Adam lost.
Look at how Jesus operated. He repeatedly stated that he only did what he saw the Father doing, and only spoke what he heard the Father saying.
He lived in continuous, unbroken communion with the divine. And Engelbrecht argues that the ultimate purpose of the cross wasn't just to forgive sins in a legalistic sense.
What was it then?
It was to completely tear the veil and restore that exact familial access for every single person.
Okay, so how does a modern person living in a hyper-connected, frantic world actually achieve this state of sonship?
It's not easy.
Engelbrecht uses terminology that I think makes a lot of modern rationalists and even traditional churchgoers very uncomfortable. He talks about mysticism, contemplative prayer, and abandonment.
Yeah, those words trigger a lot of people.
What are the actual mechanics of this? Because it sounds incredibly abstract. He asks this haunting question in the book. Why do we seek noise when in silence there is God?
The mechanics of this are heavily focused on the psychological death of the ego.
Okay.
When Engelbrecht talks about mysticism and silence, he isn't just talking about turning off your smartphone or sitting in a quiet room. He is talking about the deliberate cessation of our desperate need to perform.
The performance.
Yes. Modern religion teaches us that we have to talk constantly to God, sing louder, pray harder, and do more charitable works just to get his attention. Engelbrecht says that is the noise of the flesh trying to justify its own existence.
It's the noise of the gym member furiously pedaling the stationary bike, just to prove to the gym owner that they deserve to be there.
Precisely. To achieve sonship, you have to abandon the performance. You have to enter what the biblical texts call the secret place.
The secret place.
Engelbrecht uses a stunning metaphor to explain this mechanic. He describes the love of God as a massive, rushing waterfall.
Okay, I love a good metaphor.
Modern religion looks at the waterfall and decides it needs to build a complex system of aqueducts, pipes, and plumbing to channel that water into their specific church building so they can control who gets to drink from it.
And the more complex the plumbing gets, the more the water pressure drops.
Exactly. Engelbrecht's instruction for contemplative prayer is to stop building the plumbing.
Just stop.
Step out of the exhausting machinery of religious performance, walk directly to the waterfall, and just stand under it. Let it drench you.
Wow.
Contemplative prayer is the act of sitting in absolute silence, presenting your unadorned, unprotected self to the divine, and allowing the reality of sonship to wash over you without trying to earn it.
He provides several historical case studies of this dynamic in action, right? I want to look at the story of Abraham and Isaac because people usually read that story as a horrific test of obedience to a demanding deity.
Yeah.
How does Engelbrecht reframe it through the lens of sonship?
He views the test of Abraham not as a demand from an angry God, but as a profound, agonizing lesson in the mechanics of trust between a father and a son.
Oh, that's interesting.
By asking Abraham to place Isaac on the altar, God was mirroring his own future agony with Christ. It was an invitation for Abraham to step into the emotional reality of the Divine Father.
It was an experiential sharing of sonship.
Yes. Engelbrecht also points to Moses. Moses didn't receive the blueprints for the tabernacle by forming a committee or surveying the Israelites.
No, he went up the mountain.
He spent 40 days in terrifying, isolating silence on the mountain, face to face with the reality of God.
And he brings it all home with the parable of the prodigal son, which, if we apply Engelbrecht's entire framework here, is really the ultimate story of human religion versus divine sonship.
It is the perfect synthesis. So the younger son leaves home, exhausts his earthly currency in the sensory world, and ends up feeding pigs.
Right. His pseudo-reality collapses.
Completely. When he finally returns home, he has a religious speech prepared.
Oh, right.
He plans to say, "Make me like one of your hired servants." He is trying to negotiate a transactional religious relationship with his father based on his failure.
He is basically trying to join the laity. He's asking for a job, not a family.
But the father doesn't even let him finish the religious speech. The father completely ignores the transaction, embraces him, puts a robe on his back, and restores his status immediately.
And what about the older brother?
The older brother is the perfect picture of institutional religion. He is furious because he has stayed home and perfectly kept all the rules. He has tithed, he has worked the fields, he has attended the services, and he feels entitled to a reward.
He views the father as an employer, not a dad. Sonship, then, isn't an external reward for good behavior. It's an internal, pulsating, eternal reality that you simply have to accept. It is a state of being, not a list of doings.
It is the complete abandonment of the religious ego.
We have covered a truly massive amount of intellectual, historical, and spiritual ground today.
We really have.
Let's try to synthesize the architecture of Ryan Engelbrecht's Bastion of Divine Truth, Part 1. He is issuing an incredibly uncomfortable challenge to you, the listener. He is asking you to critically examine the foundations of everything you trust.
He is challenging you to look at the sprawling corporate structures of the institutional ecclesia and recognize them as man-made counterfeits.
He is demanding that you identify and reject the subjective sensory pseudo-realities constructed by centuries of secular philosophy, whether it's the empiricism of Locke or the state worship of Marx.
He is warning you to look closely at the pews, not just the culture outside, and recognize the subtle internal apostasy of comfortable religion, the terrifying danger of holding a form of godliness while entirely denying its actual transformative power.
He is asking you to check your spiritual wallet, to stop trying to bribe heaven with earthly resources, and to finally take the currency of faith and spend it through the kinetic act of trust.
And most importantly, he is inviting you to drop the exhausting, anxiety-inducing religious act entirely.
To stop building the plumbing.
Right.
To stop negotiating your worth. And to simply be a son or a daughter standing under the relentless waterfall of the divine.
It is a total deconstruction of human religion, aimed singularly at the reconstruction of intimate relationship.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering thought. A question of human psychology. We deeply crave structure, don't we?
We really do.
We want the architect to tell us where the load-bearing walls are because it makes us feel safe. We build institutions, rules, and denominations because the vast, untamed reality of the divine is terrifying.
It's much easier to just follow a checklist.
But if Engelbrecht is right, if true, unadulterated sonship was forged in the absolute, unstructured silence of the Garden of Eden long before rules and buildings existed. It forces us to look at our own lives. We live in a hyper-connected, endlessly noisy, desperately performative modern world. We are constantly shouting our truth, trying to build our own platforms, trying to prove our worth to algorithms and institutions alike.
It's exhausting.
So perhaps the most radical, rebellious thing you can do isn't to build a better system or to shout louder than the culture around you. Maybe the ultimate rebellion is to step away from the noise, sit in complete, terrifying silence, and face the reality that you do not have to perform to be loved.
That's a profound thought to leave on.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the structures around you, keep interrogating the blueprints you've been handed, and keep seeking the unadulterated truth. We will see you next time.